In August of 1987, a series of raids by the Victorian and Australian Federal Police were conducted on properties in the areas of the Dandenong Ranges on the outskirts of Melbourne and further north in the state at a property at Lake Eildon. The Wooden Lodge was located on a 5-acre lakeside property known as Kai Lama, surrounded by big trees and a barbed wire fence. The property belonged to a notorious cult leader, Anne Hamilton-Byrne, who the Victorian and Federal Police had been investigating for some time. On that day, the police rescued 6 children who had been taken by the New Age sect, now known as the Family. At their height, the cult known as the Family, also called the Santa Nikitan Park Association and the Great White Brotherhood, had amassed more than 200 followers, a fortune of over 50 million Australian dollars, a number of properties in Australia, the United States, the UK, and had fraudulently adopted and kidnapped up to 28 children. The children were made to believe that their cult leader, Anne Hamilton-Byrne, was their biological mother who dyed their hair bleach blonde, ordered them to wear identical clothes, and subjected them to emotional, mental, and physical abuse. Corporal punishments and forced ingestion of hallucinogenics were also commonplace. The cult itself was made up of upper middle-class professionals, such as nurses, doctors, lawyers, and social workers, who with blind loyalty followed every word of their leader, Anne Hamilton-Byrne, who paraded herself amongst her disciples as the female reincarnation of Jesus Christ. The group's beliefs were an eclectic mixture of Christianity and Eastern religious teachings, with a high emphasis on the apocalypse, brought about by natural disasters and a nuclear holocaust. Hamilton-Byrne, affectionately referred to as the teacher by her loyal followers, taught her group that with the help of extraterrestrials, they would be saved from this Armageddon and would be chosen to start a new supreme race. One of her most devoted believers was Dr. Raynor Johnson, an English-born physicist who was a master of Queen's College at Melbourne's University and co-founded the cult. So how did professionals and studious academics fall under this cruel enchantress's spells? Born Evelyn Edwards in 1921 in a small rural settlement in Victoria, her mother was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia after setting her hair alight in public and consequently spent 27 years in a psychiatric institution. Her father travelled extensively for work, and young Evelyn spent most of her formative years growing up in orphanages. In 1941, at the age of 20, Evelyn married her first husband, Lionel Harris. He joined the army and soon after was posted interstate. Lionel went AWOL for nearly 8 months and was arrested by military police after being found with his wife back in Victoria. He served another year before being discharged on compassionate grounds. Newspaper articles report that Lionel Harris was a car salesman, and the married couple had one daughter, Judith, who later changed her name to Natasha. At age 33, Lionel Harris was killed in a car accident whilst on his way to an adoption centre to an arranged adoption for a baby boy. After her husband's death, Evelyn became fascinated by yoga, a new craze that was becoming highly popular in Western society at the time. Evelyn met yoga teacher Margaret Siegsman in the early 1960s at a yoga school in Melbourne and introduced herself as Anne, a physiotherapist and nurse, none of which were true. Anne then trained and worked with Margaret, who had lived in Indian ashrams and followed a Tibetan guru. Anne would later steal these claims for her own story and opened up her own yoga classes in Geelong. Anne gathered a following in the yoga community and became very successful in drawing wealthy middle-aged women to her classes. Still passing herself off as a nurse and physiotherapist, she also made claims that she had supernatural powers, and in one instance, cast a spell on a young man who disagreed with her. Incidents like these caused her students to believe in her claims, and as her following grew, so too did her reputation. Anne met South African naval officer Michael Riley sometime in the early 60s, and later married in 1965. The marriage only lasted a year, but it was Riley's connection to English-born physicist Dr. Raynor Johnson that would be the catalyst for the founding of the New Age sect that they would call the Great White Brotherhood. Dr. Rayner Johnson was an esteemed physicist who studied at Oxford University when he earned a Master of Arts and in 1922 also gained a PhD in physics at the University of London. He held lectures and published scientific works on spectroscopy. However, by the time he took up residence as Master of Queen's College at the University of Melbourne, Johnson had become more interested in mysticism and spirituality. His beliefs began to fracture relationships with his colleagues, and despite this, he published books on his interests in parapsychology and the occult. It was in December of 1962 that Anne met Dr. Johnson just before he and his wife were due to visit India. Upon their first meeting, Anne warned Dr. Johnson that he should watch his wife closely as she could sense a danger in her health. On the trip, Dr. Johnson's wife suffered a severe attack of dysentery and had to abandon their travels to return home. On the Johnsons' return to Melbourne, they sought out Anne and quickly became the first initiates into Anne's cult, the Great White Brotherhood. Dr. Johnson became infatuated with Anne, who made outrageous claims of supernatural abilities, and later in diary entries wrote about Anne as being Christ-like. Claiming for the benefit of scientific research, the pair would experiment with LSD, in which during the sessions, he would often hallucinate her to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ in female form. Johnson and his wife bought a house in Ferny Creek and gifted it to Anne, who would host weekly meditation sessions and, with the help of the intellectually respected doctor, would recruit many wealthy New Age-seeking professionals, including doctors, psychiatrists, lawyers, nurses, and social workers. Hamilton-Byrne would often give sermons, or as she called them, discourses, from a purple throne in a specially built lodge funded by donations. In the late 1960s, it was through her followers that Anne and her sect would begin to experiment with mind-altering drugs on patients at a psychiatric hospital called New Haven. New Haven was a private psychiatric hospital owned and managed by one of the members of the sect, and many of the hospital staff were also members. Patients at New Haven were treated with hallucinogenics such as LSD, and they were also subjected to electroshock therapy, and one member was also treated with a lobotomy. Anne Hamilton-Byrne taught her followers that doomsday was around the corner, and that they could all be saved, but only if they could cancel out all the karma from their past lives. And the only way to do this was through Anne herself and a session of taking LSD, which she called clearings. Anne met her third husband, Bill Byrne, who was a wealthy Englishman who settled in Victoria. Bill was a member of the Great White Brotherhood and already had a family and wife when he met Anne. Bill's wife was quickly shunted to the side and ended up being sent to New Haven Hospital for treatment. From the late 1960s to the mid-1970s, Anne had acquired 14 children. Often these children were the biological offspring of her devoted members. Others were obtained through fraudulent adoptions arranged by her lawyers, doctors, and social workers that were part of the cult. The children's identities were changed using false birth certificates, all being given the surname Hamilton-Byrne. According to documentary filmmaker Rosie Jones, who made a documentary about the family, states that some children were literally stolen from public hospitals. In front of her devoted followers, Anne would parade around in a pregnancy smock, leading her flock to believe that she was in fact pregnant. Anne's idea for acquiring the children was that they would be the first generation of the master race after the apocalypse. By 1969, the first children began to arrive in the sect, and in 1971, a 5-acre property called Kailama, known as Uptop, at Lake Eildon, was purchased to house the children. The children's hair was bleached blonde in order to facilitate the illusion of them being related, and they all wore identical clothes. Anne and Bill would frequently travel, leaving the raising of the children to her inner circle of female devotees, referred to as aunties. The routine at Uptop involved yoga, meditation, studying spiritual texts, and vegetarianism. The aunties administered strict discipline at Anne's orders, including, but not limited to, beatings if they wet the bed, withholding food, solitary confinement, and emotional manipulation. The children were only given fruit and vegetables to eat and were forced to exercise and practice yoga whilst listening to tapes of their supposed mother giving religious instruction. According to one of the survivors, when Anne came to visit, Her favourite form of punishment was to hit them with her stiletto shoe. Some members of the cult would let their own children stay at Uptop, sometimes leaving them there for months. The scale of the group of children at its largest was 28 at one time. In 1984, the family, as they were commonly known, registered the Kai Lama property as a school, Aquinel College, which would lead to government inspections in which the children would be coached to avoid scrutiny. The children would be denied access to the outside world, and upon reaching age 14, they were required to undergo a clearing, which, as we now know, involves ingestion of hallucinogenics. Not only that, but they were routinely forced to take psychiatric drugs to make them more docile and obedient. Dr. Rainer Johnson later lamented, quote, "This is perhaps the most amazing aspect of my master's work. Viewed as a piece of organisation, with devoted and sacrificial help, it is staggering in its outlook, yet it was planned with consciousness of its magnitude and the great responsibility of this undertaking. It had to cover, say, 10 to 15 years before it could lead to success. Only a great master, equally at home, in this world and the next, could have hoped to carry it through to a conclusion. It amounted to this: a group of children, some already born here, some yet to be born, were brought together, fostered and adopted and trained from the beginning of their lives in as perfect conditions as could be provided. Their health was meticulously supervised, and all aspects of their welfare and education were considered and provided for. Before they came, it was known by the master when and where and to what parents they were coming and what qualities potentially they brought with them from past lives. It is safe to say the future age will see them, unknown though they are, as custodians and continuers of the work their master has set going in many parts of the world." End quote. Hamilton-Byrne was known in the family as the Master, and as their master, she led her followers and the children to believe that she was in fact their biological mother, imposing a strict rule of seclusion from the outside world upon her family and proscribing them the motto of unseen, unheard, unknown. To the untrained eye, this secretive family was thought to be, in public at least, nothing more than a strange family. The children were always well dressed, fed, and always had parents or guardians with them. So why would anyone raise suspicion? The media had been writing reports on the family since 1980, most notably referring to a case that involved a concerned parent of a child that had been taken by their mother and subsequently was also one of the aunties in the sect. The worried father went to the police and a judge issued a warrant for the mother's arrest. In September of 1983, the child and mother were found to be in hiding in Auckland, New Zealand. This case did not spark a wider investigation, as it was seen as more of a domestic case that should involve community services and child welfare, rather than a criminal police undertaking. However, police began to take more interest in the case in 1987 after a brave young survivor, Sarah, told her story to local police after being ejected from the family by Anne for being disobedient. According to her own memoirs, Sarah Hamilton-Byrne, who was born into the cult, left the family in 1987 with the help of friends from her ballroom dancing class. Sarah had long been rebelling against the corporal punishments and strict rules, often leading the other children on nighttime raids to steal food from neighbouring houses. It was, however, her act of confiding in a friend's mother and even inviting her over to the lodge at Lake Eildon that was strictly against a code known as Mummy's Rules that saw her being excommunicated. Sarah was prompted to talk to a private investigator who had been monitoring the family for some time, and then she spoke to the local police. Uptop was raided on Friday the 14th of August 1987, and the children were taken into protective custody. Most of the children were confused and frightened, brainwashed into thinking that outside forces were stealing them from their supposed biological mother, Anne Hamilton-Byrne, who had been residing in England with her husband Bill for some time. Former Victorian police detective Lex De Man became inadvertently involved with the case after hearing stories about the family from local police near Lake Eildon following an investigation on a school fire. Lex De Man spoke to his boss about following up on the family and was dismissed several times until he put together a report that gauged interest from the drug squad. This resulted in the establishment of Operation Forest, a task force headed by Detective Lex De Man in 1989. In 1990, the cult's lawyer was caught for producing a false statutory declaration. He agreed to cooperate and was interviewed by Operation Forest for 4 months, providing police with substantial information for building a case against Anne and Bill. But the Hamilton-Byrnes, upon learning of the raids, had gone into hiding overseas. The police and Lex De Man had no information as to the whereabouts of the Hamilton-Byrnes. In fact, a journalist remarked to De Man that even if Anne could be found, no charges would stick to her. The compassionate detective took this as a challenge and invested even more time and resources to bring the deluded cult leader to justice. The couple eluded police for several years, and the legal processes moved slowly. When police informed Sarah and the other children that due to the statutory limitation of 12 months from the date of abuse, the authorities were unable to proceed with prosecution, the brave survivors were bitterly disappointed. However, in 1993, Anne Hamilton-Byrne had made a surprising phone call to Sarah, alluding to her whereabouts. Anne and Bill had been in hiding at their property in the Catskill Mountains of New York State in America. With the help of the FBI, the couple were arrested in Hurleyville, New York, on the 4th of June 1993. Detective Lex De Man flew over to the States to aid in the extradition of Anne and Bill back to Australia. The trial was in November of 1993. Despite years of several facelifts to maintain her immortal facade, the couple's ages of being both 72 were taken into consideration, and the Hamilton-Byrnes were only charged with minor offences. The price they paid for the years of physical and mental abuse of the innocent, and not to mention the stealing and falsifying birth records and adoptions? A mere $5,000 fine. Lex De Man understandably felt that the children and the other ex-members of the cult, who had been also mistreated, were cheated of a greater justice. Sarah Hamilton-Byrne was reunited with her real birth mother and later published a memoir that ultimately saw Anne's reputation take a massive hit in the public eye. Bill Hamilton-Byrne died in 2001, and Anne was diagnosed with dementia in 2004, leaving only a few loyal followers of the cult by her side. In 2016, the brave woman who helped with the unraveling of the family, Sarah Hamilton-Byrne, had died at the age of only 46. Anne outlived her by 3 years, finally passing away in 2019 at the age of 97. In one of her last appearances, she was seen mumbling incoherently and clutching a baby doll. Thanks for watching. If you found any of the information here to be triggering or traumatic, then please call any one of the helplines listed on screen. If you would like to see one of your comments right here, then start a comment with Shadow Shoutout. And if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to see more content like this, and hit that notifications bell to keep up to date with the latest videos. And together, we can explore the strange, the terrifying, the unknown, the shadow matter.